They said Coulter Vance had lost his mind. The most powerful young rancher on the frontier, a man who turned away 3 wealthy widows in a single season, had chosen her. A woman with cracked knuckles and a leather apron. A woman who lived in a shed behind the feed store and repaired broken bridles for pocket change. Nobody could explain it. Nobody believed it. And when the whispers turned to threats, and the threats turned to something far darker, even Mara Ellison began to wonder if accepting his offer would cost her the only thing she'd ever truly owned, her life. Like and comment with the name of the city you're viewing to let me know how far this story has progressed. Now let's follow the story to the end. You won't want to miss anything. The saddlebag arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in burlap and smelling of old rot. Mara Ellison almost didn't take the job. She was behind on her rent. 2 weeks, maybe 3, she'd stopped counting, and the bag looked worse than anything she'd touched in recent memory. The leather had gone stiff along the flap, cracked in 3 places along the bottom seam, and the brass buckle on the left strap had corroded to a greenish black that she'd seen before only on things pulled out of standing water. Whatever this bag had been once, it had been neglected for a long time. Somebody had folded it wrong and stored it somewhere damp and simply forgotten it existed. The man who brought it to her workshop didn't say much at first. He set it on her workbench without asking permission, which she didn't appreciate, and he stood with his arms crossed looking around her small space the way people sometimes did, taking inventory of everything that was worn or missing, measuring the value of her life by what wasn't in it. She'd had customers like that before, men who needed something fixed but couldn't resist reminding you, just by the way they stood, that they were doing you a favor by walking through your door. She waited. "Heard you're the best leather woman in the county," he finally said. "I'm the only leather woman in the county," Mara said. "That's not the same thing." He almost smiled. Almost. "Fair enough." She pulled the burlap back and got her first proper look at the bag. Even through the damage, she could see it. The stitching pattern along the main body wasn't standard. Someone had done a crosslock technique that she'd only ever read about in one of the old guild manuals she'd found years ago in a box of books sold off from a closed-down saddler's in Pratt. It wasn't decorative, it was structural, meant to distribute weight differently, designed so the bag could carry a heavier load without the seams separating. Somebody who built this had known exactly what they were doing. "Where'd this come from?" she asked. "My father's," the man said. "Found it in the back of the barn last month. Nobody knew it was there." She turned it over in her hands. The bottom seam, cracked as it was, had been repaired at some earlier point. She could see evidence of a previous patch, older than the cracking, which meant the bag had been used hard and repaired once already before eventually being abandoned. On the underside of the flap, someone had stamped a small mark into the leather. She had to angle it toward the light from her window to make it out. 3 lines, a crosshatch, and what might have been initials. "What's your name?" she asked without looking up. "Vance," he said. "Coulter Vance." She looked up then. She'd heard the name, of course. Everybody within 40 miles had heard the name. Coulter Vance owned the Ashburn Ranch, the biggest cattle operation in the territory, inherited at 26 when his father passed and managed. Since then, with a reputation that mixed genuine respect with something more complicated. People said he was fair, but they also said he was hard, that he expected more from his workers than most men could give, that he didn't tolerate mistakes and had let go hands who'd been with his father for 15 years without any apparent hesitation. She'd also heard he was being pursued by what seemed like every widow of means in the county, and that he'd turned all of them down without much apparent regret. She hadn't expected him to be this young, or to look this tired. "I can repair it," she said carefully, "but I want you to know up front, some of this damage is deep. I can stabilize the leather and redo the seams, but it's not going to look new. That's not possible at this point. The fiber memory is gone in places." "I don't need it to look new," Coulter said. "I just need it to stop falling apart." "All right." She set it back down on the bench. 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on whether I can find the right grade of thread to match what's already here. "What's already there?" She showed him the original stitching through the hand lens she used for close work. He leaned in, and she noticed he looked at it the way she had, like he was actually seeing it, not just nodding to be polite. "That's not common," she said. "Whoever built this new and older technique, you don't see this much anymore." She paused. "Your father, do you know where he got it?" "No," Coulter said. I don't know much about where he got most things. He wasn't a man who explained himself. He paid her the deposit without arguing about the price, which surprised her, and left without much ceremony. She stood at her workbench for a while after he was gone, turning the bag slowly in her hands, thinking about the stitching and the stamp and the weight of something that had been made with that much care and then left in a barn to rot. It seemed wrong to her. It had always seemed wrong to her. The way things made with real skill got discarded. She'd built her whole small business on that wrongness, on the stubborn belief that something worth making was worth fixing. She started that same evening, even though she had 2 other jobs waiting. The work took longer than she'd estimated, which was embarrassing but not surprising. The more she cleaned the leather and got into the actual structure of the bag, the more she found. The previous repair she'd spotted, done with a slightly different thread tension than the original, had been competent but hadn't addressed the underlying stress point that caused the seam to fail in the first place. Whoever repaired it the first time had known enough to close the gap, but not enough to understand why it had opened. She had to take apart more of the original stitching than she'd planned to correct the load path properly. She also found, about a week into the work, the compartment. It wasn't visible from the outside. She'd been working on the interior lining, which had separated from the main body along the back wall, and when she eased the lining away from the leather to rebond it, she felt the difference in thickness. Not much, maybe a 1/4 inch, maybe a little less. But it was there, a pocket sewn between the outer shell and the interior lining, sealed shut with a seam that matched the original stitching so exactly that unless you had the lining pulled back and were feeling along the surface with your fingertips, you'd never know it existed. She sat with it for a few minutes before she did anything else. This wasn't her business. The bag belonged to Coulter Vance, and whatever was inside this hidden compartment was his by extension. She was here to repair the object, not to investigate it. But the seam securing the compartment had failed in one corner. She could see the gap. And if she was going to rebond the lining properly, she was going to have to deal with what was in there one way or another. She opened it carefully. What came out first was the smell, old paper, dry and faintly bitter. Then the folded sheet itself, yellowed and fragile at the creases. She spread it flat on the clean portion of her workbench and weighted the corners with small tools to keep it from curling. It took her a while to understand what she was looking at. The lines she'd initially read as decorative marks on the outer surface of the bag, the crosshatch pattern, the series of small stamps along the lower edge, weren't just there on the leather. They were echoed here on the paper, extended, connected to each other by lines she now recognized as trail markers. Elevation shifts, water sources, maybe. A route of some kind sketched in a hand that was confident but rough, not a surveyor's precision but a traveler's record. Someone writing down what they'd seen while they were seeing it. In the bottom right corner, in smaller writing than the rest, were the words, "Northwest of the Lander Ridge, crossing holds in dry season. Don't let them fill it in." She sat back in her chair. She didn't know what the Lander Ridge was. She wasn't a rancher, and she didn't know the territory well, but she understood what she was looking at in general terms. This was someone's record of a route through terrain that apparently had a crossing point of some significance, a crossing that someone had felt strongly enough about to hide in a bag that he then kept for years before it ended up forgotten in a barn. She folded the paper back the way she'd found it, returned it to the compartment, and went back to work. She told herself she'd simply hand it over when she delivered the bag. She told herself it was not her concern. She almost believed it. Coulter Vance came back on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after he'd left the deposit, which meant she was 8 days late on her promised delivery. She'd sent word through the feed store boy who sometimes ran errands for her, but she hadn't had a response, and she'd spent the better part of 2 mornings bracing for an argument. He looked at the bag for a long time without touching it. She'd done everything she could, cleaned and conditioned the leather, replaced the failed seams with thread she'd had to order specifically from a supplier 2 towns over because nothing local was the right gauge, repaired the buckle where she could, and replaced the hardware where she couldn't, rebonded the interior lining. It wasn't new. She'd told him it wouldn't be. But the original stitching was intact where it had survived, and where she'd replaced it, she'd matched the technique as closely as she was able, because it had seemed wrong to put ordinary work next to something that extraordinary. It looks like itself, Coulter said finally. That's what I was going for. He reached out and ran his thumb along the repaired seam at the base. She watched his face. He had a good face for reading work. He wasn't performing appreciation, wasn't giving her the polite nod of someone who wouldn't know the difference. He was actually looking. You matched the stitch, he said. Tried to. This is... He stopped, started again. My father used to talk about craftsmanship. He said most people couldn't tell the difference between something made right and something made to look right. Said it was a dying skill, knowing the difference. He paused. He'd have liked this. Mara had not expected that, and it caught her somewhere unguarded. She kept her expression level. There's something else, she said. She showed him the compartment, carefully, the way she'd have showed him a crack in a foundation, matter-of-factly, not making it dramatic. She spread the paper out on the workbench the same way she'd spread it for herself weeks earlier. Coulter was quiet for a very long time. You know what this is? She asked. Not entirely, he said. He was studying the marks the same careful way he'd studied the stitching. But I think I know what the Lander Ridge is. That's... He stopped again, like he was reconsidering how much to say. There's a canyon system about 60 miles northwest of here. My father used to say there was a route through it that nobody used anymore, said it led to grazing land on the other side that most ranchers didn't know existed, but I always thought that was just something he said. Old-timers talk. Doesn't sound like old-timers talk, Mara said quietly. He looked at her. No, he said slowly. I suppose it doesn't. He paid her the balance without discussion, and a fair amount over, and she almost objected but didn't, because she genuinely needed it. He started to fold the paper back up to take with the bag, then paused. You could have just handed this back to me without saying anything, he said. It's your property, she said, not mine. Some people wouldn't have seen it that way. I'm not some people. He considered her for a moment in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. Not unkindly, but with a thoroughness she wasn't used to, the same attention he'd given the work. No, he said. I can see that. He left, and she went back to the other jobs waiting on her bench, and she told herself that was that. But it wasn't that. He came back 6 days later. He didn't bring anything with him this time. He knocked on the frame of her open workshop door. She'd propped it with a stone because the day was warm, and stood waiting until she looked up from the bridle she was restitching. I had someone look at that map, he said. Fellow who knows the canyon country out there. He says the route is real. There's a crossing. Suspension bridge, old, built by a mining operation in the 40s, hasn't been used since. He says it might still be standing. That's good, Mara said carefully. My north pasture is drying up. He said it plainly, without preamble, the way a man states a fact he's already made peace with. The creek that feeds it has been dropping for 2 years. This drought isn't breaking. By fall, I'm going to be moving cattle on the usual route to winter grazing, and I'm going to lose a third of the herd doing it because the land along that route is as dry as mine. If that valley on the other side of the canyon is what this map suggests it is, he stopped. It changes things. I imagine it would, Mara said. I want to hire you to come with the drive. She put the bridle down. I repair leather, she said. I don't drive cattle. I know that. I need someone who can read that bag. The stitching, the marks. You said yourself you understood a technique in it that most people don't know anymore. The map uses the same visual language as the stitching. If we hit problems on the route, if there are marks I'm not reading right, he pulled the bag from under his arm. She hadn't noticed he'd brought it. You understand this better than anyone I've talked to. You notice things in here that I missed, that my father apparently missed. I need that. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Mr. Vance, Coulter. Coulter. She paused. What you're describing is a 60-mile cattle drive through canyon country on a route that hasn't been used in decades, with an unknown crossing and a map that was hidden in a saddlebag for what sounds like at least 30 years. Do you understand how many things could go wrong with that? Yes, he said simply. And you want to take a leather worker. I want to take the person who can read the thing that might save my ranch. She looked down at the bag on the corner of her workbench. She thought about the stitching she'd spent 3 weeks working alongside, the cross-lock technique, the care embedded in something that had been left to rot. She thought about the handwriting in the corner of the map. Don't let them fill it in. Whoever had written that had felt something worth preserving. How long? She asked. 2 weeks on the trail if conditions hold, maybe longer. I have jobs waiting. I'll pay you 3 times your standard week rate for every week we're on the trail. Whatever your jobs are worth, I'll cover the loss. She looked at him again. He wasn't bargaining. He was stating terms, and his expression said the terms were genuine and that he understood she was within her rights to say no. I'll think about it, she said. That's fair. He stood. I'm taking the herd out in 12 days. I'd need your answer before then. He left the bag on her workbench. She wasn't sure if that was intentional or an oversight, but she didn't call after him to return it. She worked through the rest of that afternoon with it sitting in the corner of her vision, that repaired old bag, looking more like itself than it had in probably 30 years. Bus. The decision, when it came, didn't come the way decisions usually came for her. Not as a conclusion, but as a recognition, the moment of realizing she'd already made up her mind sometime earlier without officially admitting it. She told him yes on the 4th day. She packed light because she didn't own much, so her toolkit, a change of clothes, the thick work gloves she used for heavy leather, the manual she'd found in that box of books years ago, the one with the guild techniques. She thought about that manual as she folded it into her bag. She'd carried it for years, read sections of it so many times the spine was soft and the pages were soft too, their edges worn from handling. It had seemed eccentric to everyone who knew about it, who carried a leather guild manual around like it was a story they needed. But she'd always felt that the techniques in it were connected to something larger than she could fully articulate, something about how objects got made and why the making mattered. She was thinking about this 3 days before the drive was due to leave when Ruth Hagley came to her workshop. Ruth Hagley was not a woman Mara knew well, but she knew of her. Everybody knew of her. Widow of one of the original cattle investors in the territory, owned property outright, dressed well, moved through town with the particular assurance of a woman who had never in her adult life had to wonder whether her rent was current. She had, by several accounts Mara had heard secondhand, expressed considerable interest in Coulter Vance over the past year. She had also, by several accounts, not been received with the warmth she'd expected. She stood in Mara's workshop doorway, looking at the space with an expression that suggested she was trying very hard not to visibly react to it. "Miss Ellison," she said. "Mrs. Hagley." Mara kept working. "Can I help you?" "I'll be brief." Ruth stepped inside exactly 1 step, as though any further would commit her to something. "I understand Coulter Vance has made you some kind of offer." Mara looked up. "He hired me for a job. That's his business and mine. He's talking about taking you on the cattle drive." Ruth's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite. "You understand how that looks." "I understand it looks like an employer hiring someone for a skill set," Mara said. "If there's something else you're suggesting, you'll have to be clearer." Ruth's jaw tightened. "You're a leather worker. What skill could you possibly have that justifies your presence on a Vance cattle drive?" "Ask him," Mara said. "He made the decision." "I'm asking you." Ruth took 1 more step into the room. "Listen to me, and I say this without malice. You are going to make a very serious mistake if you involve yourself in this. You don't understand what you're stepping into. The Vance Ranch has relationships with half the territory's major landowners. If you become a problem in those relationships, Mrs. Hagley." Mara set down her tools and turned to face her fully. She kept her voice even. "I've got no quarrel with you, but I'm going to need you to hear what I'm about to say clearly." She paused. "What I do, who I work for, and what road I take is not something you have a vote in. If Coulter Vance sees value in what I know, that's between him and me. I'm not stepping into anything that belongs to you. I never was." Ruth stared at her for a moment. Whatever she'd expected, this hadn't been it. "You'll regret this," she said finally. It wasn't quite a threat. It was almost worse. It sounded like a prediction. "Maybe," Mara said, "but that'll be my regret to carry." Ruth left without another word. Mara stood at her workbench for a moment after the footsteps faded, then sat down and picked up her tools again. Her hands were steady. She was a little surprised by that. Word moved fast in a small frontier town. By the time the cattle drive assembled at the edge of Ashburn Ranch 3 mornings later, there wasn't a person in town who didn't know that Coulter Vance had hired the leather worker from behind the feed store. The reactions were what she'd expected, and some that weren't. 3 of the supply merchants had declined to fill her personal order for trail provisions. Not Coulter's order, which they handled with their usual deference, but hers specifically, the small list she'd brought herself. She'd found out about it from the boy at the general store who looked genuinely uncomfortable when he told her, and who apologized twice even though he had nothing to apologize for. She'd thanked him, and found what she needed from a supplier on the other side of town, who either didn't know or didn't care about whatever social calculation was being run against her. The ranch hands were another matter. There were 14 of them assembled for the drive, ranging from a man named Holt, who looked to be around 60 and had clearly been working cattle longer than Mara had been alive, down to a young hand named Denny, who couldn't have been more than 17 and kept trying to look less nervous than he was. They regarded her with a spectrum of reactions, Holt with blank professionalism, Denny with frank curiosity, and several of the middle hands with a skepticism that they didn't bother to hide. One man, stocky with a red beard and a habit of spitting before he spoke, introduced himself to the group generally as Walt Greer and made a point of looking at Mara while he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Funny what a drive looks like these days." Nobody laughed. Nobody defended her either. People looked at the ground or at their horses or at nothing in particular. Coulter, standing at the head of the assembly, heard it. She could tell by the slight pause before he continued speaking. He didn't address it directly, didn't make a scene of it, but when he finished giving the day's instructions, he said, simply and without particular emphasis, "Miss Ellison is here in a professional capacity. Anybody who can't work alongside that is welcome to draw what they're owed and head back now." Nobody left. Walt Greer spat and said nothing else. Coulter caught her eye briefly after the assembly dispersed. She gave him a small nod. He gave one back and turned to deal with the cattle. She secured her pack on the horse she'd been assigned, a dun mare with a calm temperament and the unflattering name of Speck, and settled the saddlebag across the back of her saddle where she could reach it easily. She'd wrapped it in oilskin, not because rain was predicted, but because old leather didn't forgive water, and she wasn't going to be responsible for undoing 3 weeks of work with a careless moment. The herd began to move. Dust rose. Mara looked back once at the line of rooftops visible over the ridge, the general store, the feed barn, the shed behind it where she'd lived and worked for 4 years. She didn't know what she felt exactly. Not quite freedom. Not quite fear. Something in the middle that had no good name. She faced forward and rode. The first 3 days were unremarkable by the standards of what came later. The land north of the ranch was dry but open, rolling grassland with enough scrub cover that the cattle moved steadily without too much trouble, and the sky was wide and pale blue and hot. Mara settled into a rhythm alongside the drive without being part of it. She wasn't a hand, didn't pretend to be, kept out of the way of the actual work while staying close enough to be useful if the bag or the map became relevant. In the evening, she sat near the fire and worked on small repairs because she'd brought her tools and couldn't sit idle. One of the hands, a quiet man named Perez, who rarely spoke but had a way of showing up wherever something needed doing, brought her a piece of his bridle on the second evening, cracked stitching on the cheek piece, without saying anything. She fixed it overnight and set it by his saddle before dawn. He found it in the morning and looked at her across the camp and nodded. She nodded back. That was the whole of it. On the 4th day, they reached the beginning of the canyon country, and the landscape changed entirely. The rolling openness compressed. The ground became harder underfoot, the path narrower, the rock walls on either side rising as they moved further north until they were traveling through corridors of stone with the sky reduced to a bright strip overhead. The cattle didn't like it. She could see that in the way they moved, bunched closer than they should have been, heads lower. Holt rode back and forth along the sides of the herd with a practiced patience that seemed to be the primary thing keeping them moving. Coulter rode up alongside her in the afternoon of the fourth day. "We're getting close to where the route on the map starts to diverge from the main trail," he said. "I need you to look at it again." She pulled the saddlebag around and opened the inner compartment carefully, bracing the paper against the hard leather of her saddle to keep it flat in the wind. She studied the marks again, the trail indicators, the elevation shifts. "That mark there," she said, pointing to a crosshatch slightly different from the others. "Your father used a different density on the hatching. The ones along the main route are even. This one is heavier on the left side, lighter on the right." She traced it with a careful finger, not touching the paper. "I think that means you take the left when you hit a fork." Coulter looked at it for a long moment. "You're reading that from the mark?" "From the same visual language as the stitching on the bag itself," she said. "The original builder used density variation to indicate direction in the stitching pattern. Heavier thread on one side to tell you which way a stress load ran. Your father knew that convention. He used it in the map." Coulter was quiet. The canyon walls moved past them. "My father spent 3 years learning from the man who built that bag," he said. He hadn't mentioned this before. "Old saddle maker out of Kansas. He never talked about it much. My father wasn't a man who talked about his influences, I suppose. But that's where he learned to read country. Not from ranchers, from a craftsman." Mara folded the paper back carefully. "The left fork, then," Coulter said. "The left fork," she confirmed. She wasn't sure whether she believed it. Not fully. But the alternative was the tried and dying main trail. And the thing about a drought was that the roads you knew could kill you just as thoroughly as the roads you didn't. The drive turned left at the fork the following morning into country that none of them had ever traveled, following a map found in the hidden lining of a bag that had been forgotten in a barn for decades. Mara rode at the middle of the column, the bag across her saddle, the oilskin wrapping it dark with dust. Behind them, the familiar world of the territory fell away one canyon wall at a time. She told herself she wasn't afraid. She was, somewhat. But she'd been afraid before and done the work anyway, and she understood by now that fear and forward motion were not mutually exclusive. You just had to decide which one got to be in front. She chose forward. The canyon swallowed them whole. The canyon didn't ease up on the 5th day. If anything, it got worse. The walls tightened through the morning until the cattle were moving in a column so narrow that Holt had to ride ahead and behind alternately, unable to keep both flanks in sight at once. The sound changed too. The normal noise of a drive, the lowing and the hoof strike and the leather creak, all of it bounced off the stone and came back distorted, and the cattle felt it. 2 younger steers had to be physically redirected twice before noon, pulling toward the walls for reasons that made no sense unless you understood that animals sometimes panicked at echoes of themselves. Mara stayed out of it. She wasn't a hand, and she knew it, and the worst thing she could do in terrain like this was get in the way of people who knew what they were doing. She kept Speck moving at a steady pace in the middle of the column, watched, and listened. Walt Greer passed her twice without looking at her. The 3rd time he stopped. "You sure about that left fork?" he said. It wasn't a question with any genuine curiosity behind it. It was the kind of question that meant something else. "I'm sure about what the map indicates," Mara said. "Right." He looked ahead at the canyon walls. "Because this is real comfortable country we're moving through. Nobody said it would be easy, just that there was a route." Walt spat. "There's a difference between a route and a path that gets 60 head of cattle and 14 men killed in a canyon." "Yes," Mara said. "There is. I'd suggest you take that up with Coulter." He moved on. She watched his back and told herself it was just nerves, his and everyone else's, that the discomfort of the terrain was looking for somewhere to land, and she was the most available target. She understood that. It didn't mean she had to accept it, but she understood it. The afternoon brought the first real problem. A section of the canyon floor about 2 miles past the fork had flash flooded sometime in the recent past. She could read it in the debris line on the walls, the mud-caked rocks, the way the ground surface was uneven and treacherous where it had dried. The cattle didn't like the footing, and 3 of them went to their knees in a span of 10 minutes. Nobody went down hard, but it slowed everything to a crawl and cost them 2 hours of daylight they couldn't afford. Coulter rode back to where she was waiting. He didn't look rattled exactly, but he looked like a man who was doing a lot of internal calculation very quickly. How far to the next marker on the map? She had it open already, balanced on her knee. There's a mark that could indicate a widening, maybe another mile and a half north. Could indicate. The notation isn't explicit, she said, but the pattern your father used for terrain features. I think that's what this means. I can't be certain. He looked at the cattle picking their way across the flood debris, Holt and Perez and two others working them slowly forward. All right, he said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like someone adjusting to a reality that wasn't cooperating with his expectations, which was different. We keep moving. They made camp that night on a narrow shelf of ground, wide enough for the purpose, but not much more. The horses were hobbled close. The cattle were bedded in a rough line along the canyon floor below the shelf, and two hands drew the short end of it and took night watch, circling in the dark with lanterns that threw strange shadows on the stone. Mara sat by the fire after supper and worked on a broken cinch ring that Denny had brought her. The kid had been sheepish about it, worried she'd think it was a waste of her time, but she'd taken it without comment because a broken cinch ring on a night watch rotation was a serious problem, not a small one. She worked with her back to the fire, so the light fell over her shoulder onto the work. After a while, Coulter sat down across from her. He poured himself a cup of the coffee that was keeping warm near the coals and didn't say anything for a few minutes. Back in town, he said finally. Did anyone come to see you before we left? She glanced up. Ruth Hagley. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. What did she say? That I was making a mistake, that I didn't understand what I was stepping into. Mara returned her attention to the cinch ring. She wasn't entirely wrong on the second count. I knew what I was walking toward, but not all of what was walking toward me. What's been walking toward you? She set the ring down and looked at him directly. 3 supply merchants who wouldn't fill my personal provisions order. Walt Greer making sure I know I'm not welcome. Whatever conversations have happened that I haven't heard. She paused. It's not unexpected. I've been a person people look past my whole working life. I know what it feels like when that turns into something more active. Coulter was quiet for a moment. Ruth Hagley put money into 3 of the merchant operations on this side of town 2 years ago. Silent investment. Most people don't know about it. Mara looked at him. So she can call in favors. She can make things difficult. He said it flatly. I should have warned you. That's on me. It wouldn't have changed my answer, Mara said. I know, but I still should have told you. She picked the cinch ring back up. The fire popped. Somewhere down in the canyon, the cattle shifted and settled. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why me? She kept her eyes on her work. Not the explanation you gave me about the map and the stitching. I understand that part. I mean, why you came back. Why you knocked on my door again instead of just taking what you found and hiring a guide who knew the canyon country. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because when I brought that bag to you, he said slowly, I expected what everyone expects from that kind of job. Somebody would look at it, tell me what it would cost, fix it up well enough that it stopped falling apart, and hand it back. That's a reasonable transaction. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Instead, you spent 3 weeks working on a technique that died out 40 years ago, so the repair would be honest to the original. You found something hidden inside it, and your first instinct was to give it back because it wasn't yours. And when you looked at the marks on that paper, you understood them because you'd already understood something in the object itself that I'd owned for weeks without seeing. He stopped. That's not a common combination. Mara was quiet. Also, he said, with something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction, you told Ruth Hagley to stay in her own business, and I heard about it before I'd gotten back to the ranch. That counted for something, too. She did almost smile at that. Almost. Yeah, the news from town found them on the 7th day. It came through a rider, a young man named Cass who worked as a general messenger for the ranch, who had ridden hard to reach them and looked it, his horse lathered, his face carrying the particular expression of someone delivering bad news who isn't sure how it's going to land. He found Coulter at the head of the column, and the two of them rode apart from the group. Mara couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched Coulter's face during it, and what she saw there a stillness that was the opposite of calm, the kind of stillness that happens when a man is controlling something significant. Told her enough. Cass rode back south. Coulter came back to the drive and rode in silence for almost an hour. Eventually, he fell back to ride alongside Mara. "The story that's going around town," he said without preamble, "is that you convinced me to abandon the traditional route by misrepresenting what the map showed, that you've been talking to rustling operations south of here and told them where the herd is moving." Mara stared at him. "That's completely false," he said. "I know that." "Where is that coming from?" "3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count." She said nothing. The anger that moved through her was clean and sharp, and she let it move through without acting on it, because acting on it wouldn't help anything out here in a canyon 60 miles from anyone who cared. "Is there a rustling concern?" she asked. "Actual rustling, not the story about me." Coulter's jaw tightened. "Cass says there are reports of a group working the canyon routes. 3, 4 men, small operation but aggressive. They've hit 2 drives in the past 6 weeks on the southern approach." He paused. "They wouldn't know about our route. It's not the route anyone takes." "Unless someone told them," Mara said. "Unless someone told them," he agreed. They both knew who that pointed toward, and neither of them said the name because saying it out loud in the middle of a canyon wouldn't accomplish anything yet. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Keep reading the map," he said. "Stay close to the bag, and don't go anywhere alone." She nodded. That night she slept lighter than she had the previous nights, and when a sound woke her at some point in the dark hours, a horse shifting, probably, or a rock settling, she lay still and listened for a long time before deciding it was nothing and closing her eyes again. She didn't sleep again until almost dawn. The rumor traveled faster than the herd. She understood, intellectually, how these things worked. A story planted in the right place in a small community moved through it, the way water moved through dry ground, following every channel, filling every low point. By the time it stopped moving, it was everywhere, and the truth of the thing mattered less than the shape it had taken in people's minds. She'd seen it happen to others. She'd felt the edges of it herself, over years, in the smaller form of assumptions and dismissals. This was just the larger version of the same mechanism. What she hadn't expected was how much it would be about her specifically, not about Coulter's judgment, or the route itself, or the drought that had driven the decision. The story, in its circulating form, was about her. The manipulative leather worker, the nobody from behind the feed store who had somehow gotten her hooks into a man worth more than she'd ever see in 10 lifetimes. Every version of it made her the engine of the problem. Coulter was the victim. The herd was in danger because of her. Holt brought it to her directly, which surprised her. He was not a man who did things indirectly. She'd figured that out on day 1, so maybe it shouldn't have surprised her. He found her during the noon rest, while the cattle grazed on the sparse canyon grass, and the men ate, and she was checking the oilskin wrap on the bag. "You know what's coming back from town," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she said. He squatted down near her, which put him at eye level despite the height difference, and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who had spent 40 years reading people under pressure. "You do what you came out here to do," he said. "Don't let Walt Greer or anybody else get in your head." She looked at him. "You don't think I'm here to cause problems?" "I think you fixed Perez's bridle in the middle of the night without being asked," Holt said. "I think you've been riding in the middle of a column you don't belong in without complaint and without getting in anyone's way, which is more than I can say for some of the actual hands I've worked with." He stood. "I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's earning their keep and when they're not. You're earning yours." He walked away before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. She turned back to the bag. The oilskin was holding. The leather underneath was holding too. Better than she'd feared. The repaired seams had proven themselves over 7 days of trail, which quietly satisfied her in a way she hadn't let herself feel until now. She opened the inner compartment and looked at the map again. They were approaching the section her father's notation indicated as the most uncertain. The area around the Lander Ridge proper, where the canyon walls were supposed to open into a wider approach before the crossing. The marks here were denser, more detailed, which she'd taken as a sign that this was the part he'd felt most needed recording carefully. But there was a mark she'd been puzzling over for days now. It wasn't part of the trail notation. It sat at the edge of the paper, partially obscured by a water stain that had happened at some point in the bag's long storage. She'd looked at it a dozen times, and every time she came back to the same question: was this an obstacle marker or a route option? She tilted the paper in the light. The canyon walls were paler here than they'd been further south, a different stone composition that caught the afternoon light differently. She looked from the paper to the walls and back, working the visual comparison the way she worked a difficult seam, not forcing it, letting the relationship emerge. The mark wasn't an obstacle, it was a depth indicator. The canyon narrowed ahead, that was what the mark was saying, but the narrowing had a passage on the left wall, a secondary corridor barely wide enough for cattle, but navigable if you knew to look for it, that shortened the approach to the crossing by what looked like half a day's travel. Or she was wrong, and it was an obstacle after all, and taking the left wall would walk 60 head of cattle into a dead end. She folded the map back and sat with the bag in her lap, and the uncertainty sitting in her chest like a stone. This was the part nobody had warned her about, not the physical difficulty of the trail, not the rumor campaign behind them, not Walt Greer's hostility. The part where the knowledge she had was real but incomplete, and the stakes attached to being wrong were not hers alone to carry. When Coulter called the column back to moving, she rode forward and told him what she thought she'd read. She told him all of it, including the uncertainty. "Left wall corridor?" he said slowly. Shorter approach. "If I'm reading it right. How confident are you?" She thought about the honest answer to that. 65%, she said. "Maybe 70. The water damage on that section of the map makes it harder to be sure." Coulter looked at the canyon ahead. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the sky, which was clear but had a haze to the west that hadn't been there that morning. "What does 70% feel like to you?" he asked. She considered that. "Like being reasonably sure of something I can't fully prove." He was quiet for a moment. "In my experience," he said, 70% in difficult terrain beats 100% on a dying road." He called Holt forward and told him about the corridor. Holt looked at the left wall for a long moment, then looked at Mara, then looked back at the wall. "I'll ride ahead and check it," Holt said. He came back 40 minutes later with mud on his boots and a look that wasn't quite relief but was in that direction. "It's there," he said. "Narrow, real narrow, but it's there, and it opens up on the other side." Coulter looked at Mara. She looked back. "Your father hid a lot of knowledge in that bag," she said quietly. "He did," Coulter said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, "Let's move." The cattle filed into the left wall corridor one by one, slow and reluctant, the canyon pressing close. Mara went with them, the bag secure across her saddle, the afternoon light cutting sideways through the stone gap above. She thought about the map and the hidden compartment and the hands that had made both, the craftsman in Kansas, the rancher who had learned from him, the knowledge buried in an object and left in a barn and almost lost entirely. Almost. She pulled the oilskin tighter around the bag and kept moving. Behind them, the main canyon fell silent. The corridor through the left wall took 3 hours to navigate, and they lost one steer doing it. Not to the rustlers, not to anything dramatic. The animal simply went down on a slick section of rock floor about halfway through, went down hard on its front knees, and by the time Perez got to it, the leg was finished. He handled it quickly and without ceremony, the way experienced men handle necessary things, and the column kept moving because it had to. There was no room to stop, no room to turn around, and sentiment was a luxury that the canyon walls didn't allow. Mara heard the shot and felt it in her chest and didn't look back. When the corridor opened up on the other side, the relief in the column was almost physical, shoulders dropping, horses stretching their necks, the cattle spreading out instinctively into the wider space. It was still canyon country, still hemmed by walls, but the floor here was broader and drier, the footing better, and there was a scrub growth along the eastern edge that told her groundwater was closer here than it had been for the past 2 days. They made good time through the afternoon. Mara let herself believe briefly that the worst of it was behind them. She was wrong by morning. The flash flood came before dawn, not directly on them, she understood later, but somewhere in the canyon system uphill to the northwest, close enough that the water arrived with a speed that didn't match the clear sky overhead. She woke to Holt shouting and was on her feet before she was fully conscious, and the first thing she grabbed was the saddlebag because that was where her hand went without thinking. The water came through a side channel she hadn't known was there, waist high on a man and moving fast, carrying debris. The cattle panicked immediately and completely. In the chaos of the next 20 minutes, she lost track of most of what happened in any sequential way. There was noise and water and the terrible particular sound of cattle in full fear, and hands shouting to each other across the dark, and someone's lantern going out, and Speck pulling hard against her grip. When it was over and the water had receded to ankle depth and the sky was starting to gray in the east, she stood in the mud and took count of what they had. 4 steers gone, carried off or scattered into the canyon branches, unrecoverable in the dark. 1 wagon wheel cracked from impact with debris. Denny had a cut on his forearm from something he couldn't identify, not deep but bleeding steadily. 3 supply packs were soaked through and 2 of them were ruined. Coulter moved through the aftermath without talking much. That was how she'd come to read him over the past days. The quieter he got, the more serious the calculation running underneath. He looked at the ruined supplies and the remaining herd, and his face was the face of someone doing arithmetic with bad numbers. Walt Greer, to no one's surprise, chose this moment. He waited until Coulter was near enough to hear clearly, then said, loudly, to no one in particular, 14 days on a dead man's map, and we're down 6 head and half our provisions in a canyon nobody's supposed to be in. Real sound judgment. Nobody disagreed. Nobody agreed either. They just stood in the muddy aftermath and looked at their boots. Coulter turned slowly. You got something to say, Walt. Say it to me. Said it already, Walt said. This route is a disaster. We should have been on the South Trail 3 days ago. Yeah, it's dry, but it's a known dry. This here is unknown everything, and we're going to run out of food before we hit anything worth finding. We don't know that. We know more than we did. Walt jerked his chin toward Mara. We know the map she's been reading got us flooded out of half our supplies and a dead animal in a wall corridor. That's what we know. Mara felt the eyes shift toward her and kept her own eyes on Coulter. The flood came from a side canyon, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. That's not something any map made on the ground could have predicted. That's weather. And the steer in the corridor? Wet rock in a narrow space. Same answer. Walt took a step forward. He wasn't a violent man, she didn't think, but he was a man who used his physical size as punctuation when he talked. You're real good at explaining why none of this is your fault. I'm explaining what happened, Mara said. If you want to argue about fault, you can do that with Coulter. He's the one who made the decision to come this way. I gave him information, and he decided. That's how it worked. Walt looked at Coulter. That how it worked? Yes, Coulter said simply. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not resolution, but the temporary deflation of a confrontation that hadn't found its footing. Walt turned away. Other men drifted back to tasks. The crisis passed sideways rather than through. But Mara noticed that 3 of the hands stood slightly closer to Walt after that morning. Not dramatically, not with any gesture, just slightly, the geometry of loyalties shifting in small increments. They rationed from that point forward. Holt managed the provisions with the efficiency of someone who'd been through worse and knew exactly how far short rations could stretch before they became a real problem. The men ate without complaining, mostly, because complaining about food when you were the one who'd signed on for a difficult drive was considered a certain kind of weakness. But she could feel the mood compressing. The 9th day brought the cliff. They'd been following the canyon floor as the map indicated, and Mara had been tracking their position against the notation markers with increasing confidence. The last 3 landmarks had matched what the marks described, which meant either her reading was sound or she'd been consistently wrong in the same direction, and she'd chosen to believe the former. The notation indicated they were within a day and a half of the crossing. Then the canyon floor ended, not gradually. It simply stopped, dropping away in a sheer face that fell 40, maybe 50 feet to a boulder-strewn base. The cattle, fortunately, had been moving slowly enough that Holt and Perez managed to halt them well back from the edge. But the edge was unmistakably there, and the canyon continued beyond it, lower now, with the walls still rising on either side and no visible way down. Coulter stood at the edge for a long time. The wind came up from below and moved his coat. "Is this on the map?" he asked. He asked her specifically, not the air. She already had it open. She'd been studying it since the ground started to look wrong. "There's a mark here," she said. "I thought it was a terrain notation, an elevation marker. I didn't read it as a drop. Is there a way around it?" She studied the marks around it. The density, the crosshatch pattern, the position relative to the wall marks. "I think, maybe. There's a mark on the western wall that I've been reading as a water source indicator, but the shape of it is different from the other watermarks." She traced the paper without touching it. "If I'm wrong about what it means, if it's not a water source but a path marker, then there might be a descent route on the western face." Nobody said anything. Then Walt said from somewhere in the middle of the group, "You think?" "Yes," Mara said. "I think." "Well, that's just outstanding." "Walt." Holt's voice was flat and final, the voice of a man who decided he was done with it. "Shut your mouth." Walt looked at Holt, apparently calculated something, and went quiet. Coulter turned to Perez. "Take 2 men and ride the western wall. See if there's a descent." It took Perez an hour and a half. He came back with mud on his boots again. She was starting to understand that mud on Perez's boots meant he'd found something worth finding. "It's rough," he said. "Real rough. Switchback, loose shale in 2 places. Cattle aren't going to like it." He paused. "But it goes." Coulter looked at Mara. She thought about the mark on the paper, the one she'd misread as water. She thought about what it meant that her misreading had cost them an hour, but not a catastrophe. The route existed even if she'd arrived at it sideways. "How many do we think we lose on the shale sections?" Coulter asked Perez. Perez made a face. "Hard to say. Could be none, if we take it slow. Could be 2, 3, if someone panics." Coulter nodded slowly. He looked at the herd, the remaining 54 animals, and then he looked out at the canyon beyond the cliff edge, the direction they were going. "We go down," he said. They went down. It took the better part of the afternoon, and it was exactly as unpleasant as Perez's expression had suggested. The switchback was navigable, but barely. The shale sections made the horses nervous, and one of the younger steers lost its footing on the second shale stretch and went to its knees before 2 hands on foot managed to stabilize it with sheer physical effort, leaning their weight against the animal's flank until it found its feet again. Mara went down on foot, leading Speck by the reins. It was not graceful. She slipped twice on the shale, caught herself both times, and arrived at the base of the descent with her heart rate somewhere considerably above comfortable and mud on both knees. Denny materialized beside her at the bottom, looking slightly wild around the eyes, but functional. "That was something," he said. "That was something," she agreed. He looked like he was going to say more, then didn't. She understood that too. Sometimes the moment was too big for the words available. The camp that night was the quietest it had been. Men ate, checked their gear, saw to the animals, and went to sleep without much talk. The fire burned low and nobody built it up. She didn't know if it was exhaustion or something else, the cumulative weight of 10 days of difficult country sitting on everyone at once. She sat with the bag and the map and her thoughts. The crossing should be close. 1 day, maybe 2. But she'd been misreading marks, and the misreadings hadn't been catastrophic yet, and she was aware that yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The section of the map ahead was the most detailed, which should have been reassuring. More notation meant more information, but it also meant more opportunities to get something wrong. Coulter sat down across from her after the camp had mostly gone to sleep. He looked tired in a way that had moved past the surface into something deeper, the particular tiredness of someone carrying weight they can't put down. "3 hands are talking about going back," he said quietly. She looked up. "Which 3? "Walt. 2 of the younger ones he's been working on." He paused. "They'd have to go back through the corridor and the main canyon. It's not nothing. It's 2 days of hard country alone. But Walt seems to think the alternative is worse." "Is he right?" Coulter looked at her steadily. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think we're close." I think the crossing exists, and I think your father's marks have been accurate every time I've read them correctly, which means my mistakes have been the problem, not the map. She stopped. But I've also been wrong twice now, and I don't know how many times I can be wrong before it costs more than we can afford. That's honest, he said. I'm trying to be. He was quiet. The fire popped. My father used to say that the difference between a bad decision and a good one wasn't always the outcome. Sometimes a good decision goes wrong because of things you couldn't know. He said the question you had to answer was whether you'd done your honest best with what you had. He paused. I think you have. She didn't answer that, didn't know how to, exactly. What are you going to do about Walt? She asked. Let him decide. Coulter leaned forward, elbows on knees. I'm not going to hold men here who don't want to be here. That's how you get sabotage instead of mutiny, and mutiny is at least honest. He thought for a moment. But I'm not turning the whole drive around. We're too close. In the morning, Walt Greer and two of the younger hands drew their pay from the cash Coulter kept in the supply wagon and rode south. Nobody made a production of it. Holt watched them go with an expression that was professionally neutral and said nothing. Denny watched them go with something that might have been relief and said nothing. The column reformed around the absence of them and kept moving. 11 hands, 54 head, 1 saddlebag. The rustlers appeared on the 11th day. She heard them before she saw them. A sound behind the column that was wrong. A horse moving at a pace that didn't match the drive. And then Perez was shouting, and there were 3 men coming hard down the eastern canyon wall on a trail she hadn't known existed. And the cattle immediately did what cattle did, which was panic. What followed was 20 minutes of controlled chaos that she experienced mostly from the back of Speck, who had the good sense to stay close to the canyon wall and not add to the confusion. She saw Coulter and Holt and Perez working to contain the herd, saw the rustlers pulling wide trying to cut off the lead animals, heard shouting that she couldn't make out clearly over the noise. She made a decision. She didn't have a rifle. She had a leather punch, 2 knives, and the heavy work gloves she used for difficult leather. She also had a fairly detailed knowledge of what was on the eastern canyon wall above the trail the rustlers had come down, because she'd been studying the canyon walls all morning the way she studied everything, carefully, looking for the marks that told you what you needed to know. There was a debris pile halfway up that wall, a rock shelf above it that looked unstable from below, the kind of accumulation that built up over years and waited for a reason to move. She didn't think about it long enough to talk herself out of it. She pushed Speck up the eastern slope to the base of the debris pile, dismounted, and started climbing. The rock was loose and she knew it. That was rather the point. She climbed to the shelf, found the anchor stones she'd identified from below, and applied the only tool she had available, which was her weight and both feet, and the kind of determined force that comes from having nothing better to offer. The shelf gave on the 3rd attempt. It didn't come down on anyone. She'd positioned it for noise and movement, not injury, and she'd gotten what she aimed for. The debris cascade came down the eastern wall in a rush that sounded considerably worse than it was, and the effect on the 3 rustlers below was immediate and complete. Horses shied hard. One rider went off entirely, and the attempt to cut the herd dissolved in the general confusion of animals and men trying to not be where the rocks were landing. By the time she'd climbed back down to Speck, the rustlers were retreating north at speed, and Holt and Perez were getting the cattle back under control. She rode back to the column with her hands shaking. Coulter looked at her. He looked at the eastern wall where the dust from the debris was still settling. He looked back at her. Did you just... I moved some rocks, she said. Her voice came out more even than she felt. It seemed like the available option. He stared at her for another moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite any single thing she could name. Are you hurt? She checked. Her left palm was cut where she'd caught herself on the climb, not deep, and her knees were worse than they'd been after the shale descent. No, she said. Not really. Holt rode past them without stopping. He looked at Mara as he went by, and she would carry what was in his face in that moment for a long time. Not admiration exactly, not the theatrical version, just the particular respect of a man who'd seen a lot of things in 40 years of difficult work and had just seen one more. The canyon narrowed ahead. The crossing was out there somewhere in the next day, maybe less. She could feel it the way she sometimes felt when a repair was almost done. the shape of the end not yet visible but somehow already present in the work. She tightened her grip on the saddlebag and kept Spec moving. Behind her, the eastern wall stood quiet, the dust already settling, the evidence of what she'd done dissolving back into the landscape like it had never happened. The crossing appeared at midday on the 12th day, and it looked nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured something more obvious, a structure you'd see from a distance and recognize immediately as a crossing. What they found instead was a canyon mouth choked with decades of rockfall and scrub growth. And behind that debris, barely visible until you were standing almost on top of it, the remains of a suspension bridge that had been built into the canyon walls themselves. The anchor points were carved stone, deep set, the kind of work that took months and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were building something meant to outlast you. The cables, iron, not rope, had weathered to a dark rust that made them nearly invisible against the canyon stone. The deck planking was mostly gone, rotted away or carried off in floods, but the cable structure itself was intact, mostly intact. Holt walked out onto what remained of the near approach and came back looking like a man assembling a careful sentence. "The cables are sound," he said. "The anchor points are sound. The deck is gone, but the frame isn't. There's enough cross cable to walk on if you're careful and you don't weigh too much." He paused. "Cattle can't cross it. Not as it is." Mara had already been looking at the same problem from a different angle. She'd been looking at the cable structure, the spacing, the gauge of the iron, the way the cross cables were laced between the main spans. She'd been looking at the scrub timber growing along the canyon wall to the north, the cut logs from a deadfall she'd noticed 20 minutes back, and the rope coiled in the supply wagon. "We can deck it," she said. Everyone looked at her. "The main cables are solid. The frame is solid. What it's missing is a surface." She looked at Holt. "How far back was that deadfall?" "Quarter mile, maybe." "The logs are cut already. Whatever brought them down did the work. If we drag them up and lash a deck across the existing frame, we can get the cattle over." She paused. "It won't be pretty, but it'll hold." Coulter looked at the bridge, then at the canyon it crossed, then at her. "How long?" She thought about it honestly. "Rest of today, maybe into tomorrow morning." "You know how to build a bridge deck?" Perez asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "I know how to repair structural things by understanding how they were built," she said. "The principle is the same." She paused because she believed in telling the truth about uncertainty. "I've never done exactly this, but I know what needs to hold and what the load is going to be." Coulter didn't deliberate long. He turned to the remaining hands. "You heard her. Holt, take 3 men back for the logs. Perez, I need you on the near anchor points. Look for any corrosion I should know about before we start loading weight on it. Denny..." He looked at the young hand. "You're with Mara." Denny looked slightly terrified and slightly honored, which seemed about right. The work was hard in the specific way that practical problem-solving is hard. Not one large obstacle, but a continuous sequence of smaller ones, each requiring its own solution, none of them cooperating with any elegance. The logs from the deadfall were the right diameter but varied in length, which meant she had to calculate the lashing pattern to compensate for the gaps, rather than working with uniform material the way she would have preferred. The rope in the supply wagon was good quality, but there wasn't enough of it, and she had to supplement with the leather strapping she carried in her toolkit, which meant using material she understood at a deep level and which she was reasonably confident about, but also meant using material she'd brought for a different purpose and couldn't replace out here. She worked with Denny alongside her, and she discovered that the boy was better with his hands than his age suggested. He didn't ask questions that wasted time. When she showed him a lashing technique, he did it correctly the second time and didn't need to be shown again. He had the quiet competence of someone who had learned to work hard early and without much recognition for it, and she recognized that quality because she'd carried it herself. "You're good at this," she told him at some point in the afternoon. He looked slightly surprised, the way people do when they're not used to being told that. "My mother did harness work," he said. "I grew up watching." She nodded and went back to work, but she filed that away. By late afternoon, they had the first third of the deck laid and lashed. Coulter came and looked at it without touching anything, which she appreciated. People who reached out and tested things you were still building drove her half to madness. It looks solid, he said. It is solid, she said. The lashing on the cross cables is load distributing. Same principle as the original stitching on the bag, actually. Weight spreads laterally instead of concentrating at any single point. He looked at her. You worked that out from the bag. Your father's teacher worked it out decades ago. I just applied it somewhere new. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the work. My father would have understood what you just said, he said. He would have found it funny, actually, that the saddlebag taught us how to get the herd across. Does that seem funny to you? He thought about it. It seems right, he said. The rustlers came back at dusk, not the same 3 from the day before. There were 5 of them this time, appearing at the south end of the canyon on horseback, moving with the particular unhurried quality of men who believe they have more time than the people they're following. They stopped at the canyon mouth and looked at the bridge and the partially decked crossing and the herd waiting on the near bank. One of them called across the distance, "That bridge going to hold cattle?" Nobody answered. "We got no argument with you," the same man called. He had a voice that carried well. "We want the herd. You take what else you got and walk out." Coulter stood at the edge of the near bank and looked at them. Mara, from where she was working, could see his back and the set of his shoulders, and she knew, from 11 days of reading this man, that he was angry in the particular way that goes cold rather than hot. "You followed us through 60 miles of canyon country," Coulter said, not loudly but clearly enough. "That means you knew about this route. Somebody told you." The man with the carrying voice didn't answer that. "Somebody paid you to follow us and take the herd," Coulter said. "So it wouldn't matter what route we took. We were going to meet you one way or another." Still nothing. Coulter turned back to his remaining hands. He said quietly, "Finish the deck." They worked through the last of the daylight and into the dark by firelight, which was harder and slower and not something she'd have chosen. But the rustlers were behind them, and the canyon was in front of them, and the only direction that made sense was forward. Mara lashed the final section of decking at somewhere close to midnight, her hands cramped and the cut on her left palm aching where the leather strapping had been pulling against it for hours. She tested the structure by walking it end to end, feeling for any flex in the lashing points, any lateral movement that shouldn't be there. It held. "It'll take the cattle?" Holt asked. "Single file, slow," she said. "No rushing. Any hand that's loud or sudden on the crossing comes off first." Understood. They started the crossing before dawn. Single file, the way she'd specified, with Holt at the front and Perez at the rear and the other hand spaced along the canyon walls where their presence could guide, without crowding. The cattle didn't like the surface. The sound of their hooves on the lashed timber was different from anything they'd walked on before, and the slight movement of a suspension structure under load was something their instincts correctly identified as wrong. 3 of them balked at the near approach and had to be worked through with patience rather than force. But they went. One by one, 54 animals that had survived flash floods and shale descents and a debris slide, and 2 encounters with rustlers crossed a bridge that had been built from deadfall timber and leather strapping, and a principle borrowed from the stitching pattern of an old saddlebag. Mara crossed last, leading Speck, feeling the bridge move under them with each step. She kept her eyes on the far bank and didn't look down. When her feet touched solid ground on the other side, she stood still for a moment and breathed. Then she looked back. The rustlers were at the near bank. All 5 of them arrived sometime during the crossing, watching. The lead man looked at the bridge and then at his horses and did the calculation that she'd already done. A bridge decked in light timber and leather lashing would take cattle in single file, but it would not, in its current state, take horses at speed. Not reliably. And the timber was already stressed from 54 head of cattle. Perez and 2 hands were on the crossing as the last cattle came over. The lead rustler made a decision. She could see the moment he made it, and moved his horse toward the near approach. Holt picked up an axe. He looked at Coulter. Coulter looked at the bridge, and then at the cattle safely on the far bank, and then at the rustlers, and then back at Holt. "Cut it," he said. Holt cut the near anchor lashings in 4 strokes, and the decking collapsed into the canyon in a cascade of timber and leather and cut rope, and the suspension cables swung free against the canyon walls, and the crossing was gone. The rustlers stood on the far bank with a 60-foot canyon between them and everything they'd followed for 2 days. Mara watched the lead man's face from across the gap. He looked at the canyon. He looked at the cattle. He looked at her, specifically. For a moment she found difficult to read. Not rage exactly, more like the recognition of a calculation that had gone wrong in a way he hadn't expected. Then he turned his horse south, and the five of them rode back into the canyon without a word. What lay beyond the crossing was what the map had said it was, and that was not nothing. The valley opened up within a mile of the canyon mouth, and it was not the dramatic revelation she might have imagined, but something quieter and more immediate. Green. Actual green, the deep persistent color of grass that has access to water, spreading across a floor between two ridgelines that created a natural shelter from the worst of the territory's wind. A creek ran along the northern edge, clear and running well, the kind of water that meant a source higher up that the drought hadn't reached. The cattle smelled it before they saw it. The whole column shifted, the animals lifting their heads, and then they were moving toward the water with a collective certainty that was almost graceful. And she thought about how much of this, all of it, the canyon and the bridge and the weeks of hard country, had been aimed at this exact moment. Holt stood beside her watching the cattle reach the water. "Well?" he said. "Yes," she said. That was the whole of that conversation, and it was enough. They set up a proper camp for the first time in 12 days. Not a survival arrangement, but something with intention, with the wagon positioned for shelter and a cooking fire built for more than just warmth. Perez found wild onions along the creek bank, and someone produced the last of the coffee that had been rationed for 3 days, and the meal that evening was still short rations, but it tasted different from all the short rations that had come before it. Denny sat near Mara at the fire and ate without talking for a long time. Then he said, "That bridge deck. What about it?" "I've been thinking about how you worked it out, from the bag." "The principle," she said, "not the exact application." "But you saw it." He looked at her. "You saw something in a piece of leather stitching, and you used it to build a bridge in a canyon. How does someone learn to do that?" She thought about it. "You pay attention to how things are made," she said. "Not just what they do, but why they do it. Most people learn to use objects. Some people learn to understand them." She paused. "Your mother taught you more than you know, probably." He looked into the fire. "She passed when I was 12. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Then you're carrying what she gave you, and she doesn't know it. That's not nothing." He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. The fire burned, and the creek ran, and the cattle grazed in the dark on grass they'd been weeks finding. And the valley sat quiet around all of them, as though it had been waiting for a long time for someone to find the map that led here. The news from the south reached the valley on the 16th day. It came with a supply rider Coulter had sent word ahead for, a man who had ridden the eastern approach to the valley through a secondary pass that turned out to be straightforward and navigable, carrying provisions and a letter from the ranch foreman and information about what had been happening in the territory while they were in the canyon. The drought had not broken. That part wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the scale of what it had done to the ranchers who'd stayed on the traditional routes. 3 major operations south of Ashburn had lost significant portions of their herds: dry grazing, dried-up water sources, cattle that had been pushed through dried-out corridor land and come out the other side in no condition to recover quickly. 2 of those operations were names that Mara knew, not personally but by reputation, men who had been fixtures of the territory's cattle economy for decades. One of those names was a man who had been Ruth Hagley's primary investment partner in the merchant operations. Coulter read the letter twice and handed it to Holt, who read it once and handed it back. "She bet against you," Holt said. It wasn't a question. "She bet against the road," Coulter said. "Or she bet that we wouldn't make it through. Either way." He folded the letter. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who wasn't going to perform a feeling for an audience. "The result is the same." "What does that mean for the ranch?" Mara asked. Coulter looked across the valley. The herd grazing, the water running, the grass showing no sign of giving out the way everything south had given out. "It means we're in a position nobody else in the territory is in right now," he said. "Healthy herd, water, graze. When the market comes back around, and it will, we'll be the only operation with anything to sell." "And the families that work for those other operations," Mara said. He looked at her. She'd said it without accusation, but directly. "Yes," he said. Those families. He was quiet for a moment. There's room in this valley, more than we need for the herd. He was thinking as he talked, she could tell, working something out. If other operations want to winter cattle here, at a fair rate with fair terms, we can accommodate that. That's going to surprise some people. Probably. He almost smiled. I've been surprising people lately. She looked away, out at the valley, the green of it still slightly unreal after 12 days of canyon stone. The families who are in trouble, the hands who lost work when those operations went under, where do they go? Wherever work is, Coulter said, which, for the time being, is here. He paused. I'm going to need people who know this country, who know the canyon route, the crossing. Even with the deck gone, the structure can be rebuilt properly this time. And the valley needs infrastructure, wagons, equipment, shelter for the animals through winter. He looked at her. It needs someone who understands how things are built and why they hold. Mara was quiet. I'm not offering charity, he said. I'm identifying a need and the person who can fill it. I know the difference, she said. I know you do. She looked at the valley again. She thought about the shed behind the feed store, the 2 weeks of back rent, the supply merchants who'd refused her order. She thought about the guild manual in her pack, the techniques she'd spent years learning in a context too small to use them fully. She thought about Denny and his mother and the things people carried without knowing what to do with them. I'd need a proper workshop, she said. You'd have one. And I choose my own materials. I don't work with what's cheap. I work with what's right. Agreed. And I'm not staff, she said. I'm not one of the hands. Whatever arrangement we make, it's a partnership arrangement, or it's nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. The creek ran. Somewhere across the valley, a steer lode at nothing in particular. Partnership, he said. Yes. She nodded once. He nodded back. Neither of them said anything else because neither of them were people who needed to say more than the thing that needed saying. That evening, she sat by the creek alone for a while, her boots off and her feet in the water, the saddlebag across her lap. The leather was holding well, better than she'd had any right to expect after 12 days of canyon country and a flash flood and a crossing that had tested everything attached to a saddle. The repaired seams were intact. The oilskin had done its job. She opened the inner compartment one more time and looked at the map. She'd looked at it so many times in the past 2 weeks that she knew it, the way she knew the guild manual. Not just what it said, but how it said it. The particular vocabulary of marks that a man had developed to record what he'd seen in country nobody else was looking at. She thought about the hands that had made the bag, and the hands that had learned from those hands, and the hands that had made the map, and the hands that had found the compartment 3 decades later and brought it back to life. She folded the map carefully and returned it to the compartment and closed the bag and set it beside her on the creek bank. The valley was dark now, except for the fire and the stars, and the cattle were settled and the creek ran on, and Mara Ellison sat with her feet in cold water thinking about what it meant to find the thing you were built for. Even if you found it 60 miles from anywhere, at the end of a road nobody else had been willing to take. The workshop went up in October, 6 weeks after they'd come through the canyon. It wasn't much to look at initially. A timber frame structure built against the southern ridge wall where the rock face provided natural insulation, with a roof that Mara had specified herself, because most people building workshops didn't think carefully enough about where the light came from and at what angle. She needed north-facing light, steady and indirect, the kind that didn't shift through the day and distort what you were seeing when you were doing close work. She'd explained this to the 2 men Coulter assigned to the build, and they'd looked at each other in the way people did when they weren't sure if a requirement was legitimate or eccentric, and then they'd built it the way she asked because Coulter had told them to. She moved her tools in on a Tuesday. It felt, she thought, like nothing she had a word for. Not triumph. Too quiet for that. More like arriving somewhere she'd been moving toward for a long time without knowing the destination had a name. The valley was filling up by then. It hadn't been a fast process or a clean one. Nothing about the frontier ever was. But the word had traveled south through the territory the same way all words traveled, following the lines of need and desperation. And the families that arrived did so in ones and twos, mostly, with what they'd managed to carry and the kind of faces that come from too many weeks of not knowing what was next. Coulter didn't turn anyone away. That was the decision that surprised people most, she thought. Not the valley itself, not the route, or the bridge, or any of the dramatic things, but simply that, the willingness to make room. He set fair terms for the cattle operations that wanted to use the valley's grazing land, and he was fair in the literal sense, not the soft version of it. The rates were real rates that reflected real value, not charity dressed up as commerce. He was particular about that distinction, and she understood why. Charity made people feel owned. Fair terms made them feel capable, which was a different thing entirely and mattered more in the long run. Mara built 3 wagon repairs in the first 2 weeks of the workshop being functional, and word of that traveled too. The reckoning with Ruth Hagley came in November, and it came not with drama but with paperwork, which was somehow more appropriate. A lawyer arrived from the county seat with documents relating to the merchant investment operations, the 3 who'd refused Mara's supply order before the drive. The drought had hit their supplier network hard. 2 of the 3 operations were restructuring, and the investment position Ruth Hagley held in them had become a liability rather than an asset. The legal situation was complicated and Mara didn't follow all of it, but the essential shape was clear enough. The financial mechanism Ruth had used to apply pressure before the drive had turned back on her. She didn't come to the valley herself. Mara hadn't expected her to. What she sent instead was a letter addressed to Coulter, which he read once and handed to Mara without comment. It was a business letter in its form, formal language, careful phrasing, nothing that could be held against her in any direct way. But underneath the formality was something Mara recognized, having written enough difficult letters of her own over the years, the particular syntax of a person acknowledging a reality they hadn't chosen. Ruth was asking whether there was any commercial arrangement to be made regarding the valley's resources. Coulter's response, which Mara watched him write at the camp table on a cold evening with the fire going and his breath visible in the air, took about 10 minutes. "What did you say?" she asked when he set down the pen. "That the valley operates on fair terms available to any legitimate operation in the territory," he said. "Same as everyone else." "That's all?" "That's enough." He folded the letter. "She's not a villain. She's a woman who made a calculation that didn't work out and used methods I don't respect to protect an investment. That's—" He paused. "That's not uncommon. It doesn't make it right. But burning her down doesn't build anything." Mara looked at him. "You're more generous than I am." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just don't want to spend energy on it." He looked at her directly. "She didn't stop you. That's what matters." Mara thought about that for a moment. "No," she said. "She didn't." She wasn't sure she felt generous about it the way Coulter seemed to. She wasn't sure she needed to. What she felt was something more like indifference, which was its own kind of victory. The thing that had been designed to make her feel small had failed, and she had moved far enough past it that the original wound had lost most of its shape. Walt Greer came back in December. She heard about it before she saw it. Perez mentioned it at the workshop door one morning, just in passing, the way he mentioned most things. Walt had come up from the south with a request for work. She thought about that for a day before she said anything to Coulter. "I know," he said when she brought it up. He was mending a fence line on the valley's western edge, a job he did himself when he could because he said it was the kind of work that let him think. "He asked me yesterday." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." He pulled a wire tight and secured it. "You made a mistake out there. He undermined you at every opportunity he had, and he left when it counted, and he was wrong about the route." He paused. "He also knows cattle better than almost anyone I've got, and he came back, which means he knows he was wrong." "Did he say that?" "Not in words." Coulter moved to the next post. "Walt doesn't do things in words. He showed up. That's his version of saying it." Mara looked out across the valley. The herd was visible in the middle distance, doing what cattle do in good grass, grazing, moving slowly, ignoring everything else. Healthy animals. She'd watched them come back from the condition the trail had put them in, and it had taken weeks, but they'd come back. "It's your call," she said. "I know, but I'm asking what you think." She was quiet for a moment. "I think people make decisions under pressure that aren't always who they are at their best," she said. "I think he was scared, and scared people look for somewhere to put it. and I was the available target. She paused. I don't think that makes it fine. I just think if he can work alongside me without making it a problem, then the past can stay in the past. Coulter looked at her. And if he can't? Then it becomes your problem again, she said, and you handle it. Walt Greer started work on Monday. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to and wouldn't have known what to do with it if he had. He did, on the third day, bring her a broken saddle tree that he'd found in the equipment store and set it on her workshop bench without a word. She looked at it. She looked at him. He went back to work. She repaired the saddle tree. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Not friendship, not warmth, but the functional piece of people who have decided to do the work in front of them and let that be sufficient. She'd lived most of her life in that space. She knew how to operate there. Denny stayed. She hadn't been sure he would. He was young, and young men on the frontier had a tendency to keep moving, the forward momentum of not enough experience to know where they were trying to get to. But he came to her workshop on a morning in November and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and asked if she needed an apprentice. She looked at him for a long time. I'm not going to teach you the easy version, she said. If you're here, you learn it right. The old techniques, the real load calculations, all of it, it takes years. I know, he said, and I can't pay you much to start. The work is the payment at the beginning. I know that too. She thought about his mother, the harness work, the things he'd been carrying without knowing what they were worth. She thought about the guild manual and the techniques she'd spent years learning in a shed that was too small for the knowledge she was accumulating. She thought about what it meant to pass something forward. Monday morning, she said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. He was there at 5:45, which told her everything she needed to know. The gathering happened at the end of January, when the valley was cold but the grass was still holding under the frost and the creek was running clear, and the number of people who'd found their way to this place had grown past what anyone had originally calculated. It wasn't a formal event in the way Mara would have understood formal events. There was no hall, no arranged seating, just a fire built large in the open ground between the valley's main camp and the ridgeline. And people gathered around it because it was cold and the fire was there, and enough of them had something to say that it became a gathering by accumulation rather than by plan. Coulter spoke, which surprised nobody. He talked about the drive and the canyon and the valley in the direct, undecorated way he did everything, not inflating it into something more dramatic than it had been, but not minimizing it either. He acknowledged the hands who'd stayed through the hardest days. He acknowledged the families who'd come south, no, north, through a different approach, and found work and made the valley into something more than a cattle operation. He talked about what the plan was for the coming year, the permanent crossing they intended to rebuild, the infrastructure, the grazing agreements. Then he talked about Mara. She hadn't known he was going to, and she wasn't the kind of person who took well to being the subject of public attention, and she stood near the edge of the firelight feeling something uncomfortable move through her. He didn't dress it up. He wasn't a man who dressed things up. He said, most of you know there was a saddlebag. Some of you know what was in it and what it took to find it. What most of you don't know is that the bag came to me as a job lot, a thing to be fixed. And the person who fixed it understood something in it that nobody in my family had ever seen, including my father who owned it for 30 years. She gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. And then she came 6 days into canyon country she'd never seen, on a route that hadn't been traveled in decades. And she read a map in a dead visual language. And she built a bridge in a canyon out of deadfall timber and leather strapping. And she brought 60 head of cattle through a crossing that should not have been possible. He paused. I picked the route, he said. She made it work. That's the honest accounting. The gathering was quiet. The fire moved. She felt Holt standing a few feet to her left, his arms crossed, his expression doing what his expressions usually did. Nothing readable, which in its own way was the clearest signal he had. I also want to say this, Coulter continued, and his voice shifted slightly. Not louder, but more direct, the way it shifted when he was getting to the part he'd been working toward. There were people in this territory who decided before we left that Mara Ellison was the problem, that she was here for the wrong reasons, that she had no business on that drive, that whatever she knew wasn't worth knowing. He looked around the fire. I want those people's, and and some of them are here, and I know which ones, to sit with the fact that you had the same information I had, and you read it differently. You looked at a woman with cracked hands and a leather apron, and you decided she wasn't worth the room she took up. He stopped. I looked at the same woman, and I saw someone who understood things the rest of us had forgotten how to understand. The valley is what happened because of that difference. The silence went on for a moment. Then someone started to clap. She didn't see who, and she was almost certain she didn't want to know. And it spread, not wildly, not the theatrical kind, but the solid kind that comes from people who mean it. Mara looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked up. She found Coulter's eyes across the fire. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at the stitching on the bag that first day in her workshop, with the specific attention of someone who was seeing something clearly rather than politely. She gave him the same small nod she'd given him when he'd defended her to Walt Greer at the head of the column all those weeks ago in a different world. He gave it back. Later, when the gathering had dissolved into smaller conversations and the fire had burned lower, Coulter found her sitting on the creek bank, the same spot she'd been that evening in October with her feet in the water and the bag across her lap, which she would only later recognize as a pattern, returning to water when she needed to think. He sat down beside her. The creek was too cold for feet tonight, and she'd kept her boots on. Partnership, he said. She looked at him. I've been thinking about what that means going forward, he said. Not just the workshop, the valley, the route, the decisions about how this place grows. He paused. He wasn't a man who spoke when he didn't have something to say, and he was working towards something specific. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. She waited. Build this with me, he said. Not as an employee, not as a contracted partner, as someone who has a share in what this becomes. He stopped. I'm not saying it well. You're saying it fine, she said. I'm saying what my father built, he built alone, and he left it in a barn, and it rotted. What I've been trying to do out here, I couldn't have done without you, and I think what happens next... He stopped again. I think what happens next needs what you know the way the crossing needed what you knew. And I don't want that to be a professional arrangement. I want it to be Coulter. He looked at her. I know what you're asking, she said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the shed behind the feed store. She thought about 2 weeks of back rent and a supply merchant who wouldn't fill her order, and a woman in good clothes standing in her workshop doorway telling her she was making a mistake. She thought about 12 days in a canyon and a bridge built from deadfall, and the way cattle smelled water from half a mile off, and moved toward it with a certainty she'd envied in the moment. She thought about the bag, sitting in her workshop now, on the shelf she'd built specifically for it. She'd meant to return it to Coulter properly once the workshop was finished, but somehow it had stayed. It belonged there, she'd decided. It had brought her here. It was only right that it stay in the place it had led to. I'm not easy to work with, she said. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't let go of them easily. I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I won't soften it much. I know, he said, and I'm not going to change what I am because it's more convenient for the territory's opinion of how things should look. I'm not asking you to. She looked at the creek. The water moved in the dark, the sound of it steady and unremarkable, the way water always sounded, indifferent to everything except the direction it was going. All right, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, all right? Yes. She looked at him. All right. He exhaled. She hadn't known he'd been holding his breath and found that she was glad to know it, that he'd been uncertain, that the question had cost him something to ask, that it wasn't the easy confidence of a man who assumed the answer. It made it real in a way that ease wouldn't have. They sat by the creek for a while in the cold, not talking much, and it was comfortable in the way that being beside someone who doesn't require performance from you is comfortable. The specific relief of that, which she hadn't known she'd been missing until she felt what its presence was like. Spring came slowly that year, the way springs come after hard winters, grudgingly, in fits, with cold snapping back every time you thought it had relented for good. But it came. The crossing got rebuilt in March. Properly this time, with cut timber hauled through the secondary eastern pass and iron hardware ordered from a supplier in the county seat who'd gotten very interested in the valley's business, Once it became clear the valley was going to be the valley for some time. Mara designed the deck structure herself, working from the principles she'd applied in the dark with deadfall and leather rope, formalizing them into something that would last more than a single crossing. She stood on the finished bridge on the morning they opened it to use and walked it end to end the way she'd walked the emergency deck, feeling for movement, for flex in the lashing points. There was always some in a suspension structure, and some was correct, the right amount of give to distribute load rather than concentrate it. Holt walked out beside her and stood at the midpoint, looking into the canyon. 60 feet, he said. Give or take. Last time we crossed this, you built it in a night from trash wood. It wasn't trash wood, she said. It was deadfall. There's a difference. He looked at her sideways, the almost smile that was as close as Holt got. Yes, ma'am, he said. There is. She looked down into the canyon for a moment, the depth of it, the stone walls, the way the light moved at the bottom in the early morning. She thought about what it had cost to get here, the steer in the corridor, the provisions lost to the flood, the hands who'd gone back, the cut on her palm that had healed to a small scar she still felt sometimes when the weather changed. None of it felt wasted. That was the thing she hadn't expected to feel, that none of the hard parts felt wasted, because they were the only path to this specific place, and this specific place was worth the cost of the road that led to it. She thought about the people who had decided she wasn't worth the room she took up. Ruth Hagley, in the workshop doorway. The supply merchants. Walt Greer spitting in the dust before the column moved. She thought about what those judgments had been based on. The apron, the cracked hands, the shed behind the feed store, the math of what she appeared to be worth from the outside. She didn't feel anger about it anymore. She wasn't sure when that had shifted. At some point, the anger had become something quieter, not quite forgiveness and not quite indifference, but the thing between them. The understanding that people see what they expect to see, and that the only real answer to being underestimated is to outlast the estimation. She had outlasted it. The valley was the evidence of that. She turned and walked back off the bridge onto solid ground and went back to work because there was always work, and work was where she'd always been most herself. Not in the recognition of it, not in this moment, or the gathering by the fire, or Coulter's words, or any of the outward things that had accumulated since the canyon, but in the actual doing of it, the thing made with hands that understood what they were handling. That was the lesson in the old bag, she thought. That was what the craftsman in Kansas had built into it decades ago, and what Coulter's father had learned from him, and what the neglected object had carried forward through 30 years of a barn. Not the map, not even the route, but the understanding that the quality of attention you bring to what you make is the thing that makes it worth finding. She'd been paying that quality of attention her whole working life in a shed too small for what she knew. The valley was the first place big enough for it. She walked back to her workshop in the spring light, her boots on the cold ground, the creek running alongside her, and behind her on the canyon wall, the suspension bridge stood solid and new, and exactly what she'd meant it to be. Built right, built to last, built on principles as old as the man who'd first stitched them into a saddlebag that everyone else had forgotten. Not everyone. Not quite. She'd remembered. And that, in the end, had been enough.